Have you ever been fired so suddenly, so arrogantly, that the people who kicked you out had no idea they just pulled the plug on their own future? Have you ever watched someone call you outdated, only to learn the hard way that the person they dismissed was the one protecting everything they depended on? And here is the real question I want you to think about. What happens when the quietest person in the room is also the one holding the entire company's heartbeat? Before you answer that, tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were truly capable of? Now, let me take a deep breath and invite you into my story. It is painful, shocking, frustrating, and honestly, a little sweet in the end. This is the truth of what happened when they fired me without listening, so sit with me for a moment and let me share what I went through. Here is my confession. My name is Marissa Hale. I am 38 years old, and for the past 12 years I have served as the Senior Network Integrity Architect at Redwood Dynamics, the largest logistics company in my home state of Colorado. I grew up in a small mountain town where people were taught to take pride in every bolt they tightened and every line of code they wrote. I carried that same discipline into my career, building systems that kept this company alive long before the new executives even knew what a command line was. That is why the moment still burns in my memory like it happened this morning. I sat across from Elliot Drake, our newly promoted acting chief executive officer, in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and arrogance. His expression was smug, entitled, and careless, as if he had already decided the outcome of the meeting before I even walked in. He leaned back in his oversized leather chair and said, "Marissa, your methods are outdated. We need fresh direction, and Sierra will be taking over your role." Sierra was his 29-year-old sister who once unplugged the main router because she believed it was blinking too aggressively. I stared at him, trying to process the absurdity of placing her in charge of the entire network. I warned them calmly, telling them that my position was not something that could be replaced like a broken light bulb, that our infrastructure depended on a specialized verification system built around my unique credentials. Elliot waved his hand dismissively, as if brushing away an old book collecting dust. His eyes told me that he had no interest in understanding anything I had to say. A quiet resentment settled in my chest. Before I even had time to gather my thoughts, security appeared behind me. At exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, I was escorted out of the building I had protected for more than a decade. I walked out with disappointment, anger, and a strange, simmering certainty that they had no idea what they had just set in motion. If you want, I can continue writing Section 2 in the same style and length. As I walked across the parking lot with my box of personal items balanced in my arms, the cold Colorado air hit my face in a way that felt almost symbolic, like the universe itself was whispering. They have no idea what they just did. The resentment that had settled in my chest slowly shifted into something sharper, something quieter, something that felt a lot like resolve, because while Elliot believed he was replacing an outdated cog in his shining new machine, he had forgotten one very important truth. I was not a cog. I was the architect of the thing that kept the entire company alive. Years ago, after a catastrophic data breach nearly brought Redwood Dynamics to its knees, the founder's trusted mentor, Walter Crowe, and I created something we called the Guardian Protocol. It was not glamorous, and it was not something you would find advertised on a company brochure, but it was the backbone of everything. It monitored the health of the network, the servers, the internal identities, and even the behavioral patterns of the people who manage them. It had one core rule so simple that even Elliot could have understood it if he had bothered to listen. The system checked for my digital signature every 36 hours. If that signature did not appear, the system assumed that the network had been compromised, that I had been forcibly removed or incapacitated, or that an internal takeover was underway. When that happened, the Guardian Protocol would quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation begin locking down the company from the inside out. I tried explaining this when they forced my termination, but Elliot only heard what he wanted to hear. In his mind, I was simply being dramatic. The truth was far less theatrical and far more dangerous, and as I drove away from the building I had spent 12 years protecting, I realized something with a slow, chilling clarity. My missing signature had already started the countdown. The moment the realization settled in that my missing signature had already triggered the countdown, my mind drifted back to the chaotic termination meeting that had unfolded only an hour earlier. The scene played out in my memory with painful clarity. HR had rushed the process as if speed could somehow justify ignorance. Papers were shoved in front of me. Access cards were demanded. A sense of urgency filled the room, but none of them understood the danger behind their own recklessness. Elliot stood at the head of the table pretending to be composed, but his impatience seeped through every shallow breath he took. Sierra sat beside him, tapping her pen nervously against her notebook, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid the room itself might start malfunctioning. They ordered me to transfer full system ownership immediately. They wanted control, but they did not want to hear the truth about what that control actually meant. I tried one last time to reason with them. I told them that ownership and authentication were not the same. The Guardian Protocol required my unique verification, something embedded deep within the architecture that could not simply be handed over like a key card. Elliot interrupted me mid-sentence. "Just get it done, Marissa," he said, his voice sharp with irritation. We do not need another lecture." Sierra added, "You are making this way more dramatic than it needs to be." Despite every warning I gave, they insisted, so I walked them through the transfer interface, my hands steady even as frustration burned inside me. The system flashed an unmistakable alert: security heartbeat mismatch, integrity risk detected. Elliot rolled his eyes and ordered me to confirm. The moment I clicked that button, I felt something shift. Not in the system. In me. Because I knew the countdown had begun, and I knew they had no idea what was coming. When I walked out of that building, I felt the transfer weighing on me like a stone. I knew exactly what would happen the moment HR deactivated my account, and yet there was nothing I could do to stop it. They had insisted on tearing the safety net out from under themselves. They had insisted on silencing the only person who understood the heartbeat of their network at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. While I was still pulling out of the parking lot, I imagined the system sending out its first quiet ping to verify my signature. It would check the credential. It would check the encrypted token. It would check the timestamp of my last authenticated action. And it would receive nothing in return. No response. No signature. No heartbeat. That missing signal was the loudest message the system could ever hear. In its world of logic, silence meant danger. By the time I reached the highway, the Guardian Protocol had already marked my signature as suspiciously absent. It would wait, because it was designed to give the benefit of the doubt. But as each hour ticked by, it would escalate its internal warnings, tracing every pathway, every subsystem, scanning for answers that would never come. Meanwhile, back at Redwood Dynamics, Elliot and Sierra believed everything was under control. They thought the transfer made them powerful. They thought replacing me was as simple as changing a password. They had no idea that the clock had already started its march toward total lockdown. As I merged into traffic, a strange combination of sadness and certainty washed over me. They had pushed me out without listening. They had ignored every warning, and now the system I built was preparing to protect the company from exactly the type of reckless takeover they were attempting. There was no turning back. The countdown had begun, and it was only a matter of time before it reached zero. When the Guardian Protocol finally decided that silence meant danger, it did not panic. It did not scream or spark or flash. It simply moved with the cold, steady confidence of a system built to protect. At 3:10 in the afternoon, long before anyone in leadership understood the storm they had created, the protocol began shutting down the company from the inside out. It started with the internal authentication servers. Every identity token that did not match the verified blueprint was quietly revoked, Sierra's newly granted credentials were the first to fail. Her workstation would have displayed a simple message: access denied. Integrity, check failed. From there, the shutdown rippled through the network like a tide rolling across a quiet shore. The warehouse scanners lost connection. Automated robots froze mid-route, some still carrying pallets they could no longer deliver. Customer portals flickered out of existence. The website redirected to a blank screen. Every server, every system, every piece of machinery that relied on the digital heartbeat I once supplied began falling into stillness. By the time the internal phone system collapsed, employees were wandering through hallways with confusion spreading like a second wave. No one could call for help. No one could reach IT. No one could even send an email to report the failure. Screens everywhere displayed the same sentence in stark white letters: unauthorized activity detected, Guardian protocol engaged. I imagined Elliot standing in the operations center, staring at the dark monitors with rising panic tightening his chest. He would ask Sierra what was happening. Sierra would frantically tap keys that no longer responded, and the truth would finally start sinking in. This was not a malfunction. This was not a glitch. This was the very safety system they ignored, now doing exactly what it had been built to do. The collapse had begun, and they were powerless to stop it. While Redwood Dynamics descended into digital silence, I was at home brewing a cup of tea, trying to process the strange mixture of sadness and inevitability swirling inside me. I did not celebrate what was happening, but I also did not regret warning them. I gave them every chance to listen. They chose arrogance instead. Around 6 in the evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, I heard Linda Avery, the chief financial officer, sounding like someone who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Her voice trembled as she said, "Marissa, the company is in trouble. Everything is frozen. We missed 2 bank transmissions. We cannot process payroll. We cannot move inventory. We need your help." Her desperation was real, and for a moment I felt a pang of sympathy. Before I could respond, another call came in, followed by a knock at my front door. A courier stood there holding a thick envelope stamped with the company logo. He handed it to me without a word. Inside was a letter signed by Elliot himself. The words were sharp, cold, and dripping with accusation. Cease and desist. Do not interfere with company property. Any attempt to access Redwood Dynamics systems will be considered a breach of contract. I stood there in my hallway, reading the letter twice just to absorb the absurdity of it. They wanted me to fix their disaster, yet also threatened me if I dared to touch the very systems I built. That was when something inside me settled with complete clarity. I was done saving people who insisted on throwing themselves into the fire. I sent Linda a simple message. The Guardian protocol is functioning as designed. It activates when leadership takes actions that threaten system security. I placed the letter on my kitchen counter. If they wanted to escalate this, they had no idea what they were stepping into. The panic had begun, and their desperation would only grow. I knew it would only be a matter of time before someone at Redwood Dynamics dug deep enough to discover the truth they had ignored for years. That moment arrived later that night, long after the office lights should have dimmed and everyone should have gone home. Instead, the building was buzzing with panic, anger, and the realization that they were losing millions of dollars every passing hour. I pictured Marcus Reed, the general counsel, standing in the dimly lit storage room where the disaster recovery binders were kept, dust collecting on their covers like forgotten warnings. He pulled out the thick blue binder labeled Integrity and Continuity Protocols, the one Walter and I had written together with painstaking care. When Marcus flipped it open, he found it immediately, a clause highlighted in bright yellow, signed by both Walter and the original founder. No senior system architect may be terminated without a mandatory 72-hour transition period, under penalty of violating federal compliance standards and corporate charter protections. It was not a suggestion. It was a binding rule. And Elliot had shattered it in the most reckless way possible. Marcus, being the type of man who valued rules more than titles, brought the binder to the board's emergency conference call. I imagined the tension in that room as the board members absorbed the weight of what had been violated. The chairman, Samuel Grant, would have gone silent at first, the kind of silence that carried more danger than any raised voice. Then came the inevitable blow. "Elliot," he must have said, "you have exposed this company to catastrophic legal consequences. You will step aside immediately." The board ordered Marcus to contact me, not with threats, not with arrogance, but with respect. They knew now that the Guardian Protocol was not their enemy. Their own ignorance was, and they finally understood that I was the only one who could bring the company back from the edge. When Marcus finally called me, his voice carried none of the arrogance I had grown used to hearing from leadership. Instead, it was steady, respectful, and edged with urgency. "Marissa," he said, "the board is requesting an immediate meeting with you. They understand the situation now. They would like to discuss terms." It was remarkable how quickly attitudes changed when millions of dollars and reputations were on the line. I agreed to join their emergency video call, not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to hear, face to face, just how deeply they now regretted the choices they made. When the screen loaded, every board member sat there looking drained, worried, and aware of the power I held. Even through the pixels, the silence carried weight. Then Chairman Grant spoke. "Ms. Hale," he said, voice low and controlled, "we want to make this right. What will it take to bring you back long enough to reverse the Guardian Protocol?" I took a slow breath and felt every ounce of resentment, disappointment, and dignity settle into calm resolve. "I will return," I said, "but only as an independent consultant. My rate is $600 per hour, paid in full before I begin work." No one protested, so I continued. "I want a written apology from the executive team, delivered to every employee. I want complete authority over all information systems. No interference, no overrides, no exceptions. And I want my severance package tripled and wired to my account before I set foot in that building." For a moment, the call was silent. Then Chairman Grant nodded. "Done." On another window, I saw Elliot sitting off to the side, pale and furious but powerless. Sierra was not even present. They had finally understood that treating me as disposable had consequences. The negotiation ended quickly, not because I demanded too much, but because they needed me far more than they ever realized. The next morning, I woke before sunrise with a calmness that felt almost unreal. Overnight, the board had wired every cent into my account, sent the written apology signed by every executive, and granted me full, unrestricted authority over the entire information infrastructure. They moved faster for me in 12 hours than they ever had in 12 years. When I arrived at Redwood Dynamics, the air inside the building was thick with tension. Employees stood in clusters whispering, glancing toward me with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if I were a firefighter walking into a burning house. I did not waste time acknowledging the stares. I had a mission. I headed straight for the secure systems room, the place I had spent countless nights designing, patching, and protecting. Elliot was standing outside the door, attempting to look composed, but his eyes gave him away. He stepped aside without a word. Inside, the room hummed with the faint echo of dormant systems waiting for a signal they trusted. I approached the main terminal, placed my palm on the biometric reader, and connected the physical token that only Walter and I had ever used. The system recognized me instantly, identifying my heartbeat not just as a credential, but as a living signature embedded deep in the architecture. The final step required the override phrase. It was a line of poetry Walter and I had chosen years ago, something symbolic, something unforgettable. I whispered it softly. "The river returns to its path." The screen flickered, glowed, and then came back to life. Systems began waking like a rising sun moving across a still landscape. Robots resumed their routes. Scanners reconnected. Servers breathed back into existence. Phone lines warmed with activity, with each indicator returning to green. A wave of relief swept through the building. I had restored the company they nearly destroyed. And every person in that room knew exactly who had saved them. When the last system returned to full functionality, a quiet hush settled over the operations center. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, when everyone realizes they survived something far bigger than they understood. I stepped back from the terminal, letting the hum of restored servers wash over me. For the first time in days, I felt steady, grounded, and in control of my own story. Employees looked at me with relief, gratitude, and something else. Respect. Real respect. The kind that is earned through action, not titles. As I prepared to leave, Elliot approached me with a hesitance I had never seen in him before. His arrogance had drained away, replaced by the weight of consequences. He opened his mouth as if to apologize, but no words came out. He simply nodded and stepped aside. It was enough. Outside the building, the board released an internal statement announcing Elliot's reassignment to a new role titled Strategic Development Projects, a position that everyone understood meant he no longer had authority over anything critical. Sierra resigned quietly before noon, her desk cleared before most employees even arrived. Later that week, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. The return address made my heart warm instantly. It was from Walter Crowe. His handwriting wavered slightly, but the message was clear. Marissa, you carried the integrity of that company when no one else could see the danger. You saved their future because you built the foundation they stood on. I am proud of you. Never let anyone convince you that your value is negotiable. I placed the letter on my shelf next to the framed blueprint of the Guardian Protocol. Today, I work from home on my own terms. Paid what I am worth, respected for what I know, and free from the people who once underestimated me. And if there is one truth I hope people remember from my story, it is this: never assume the quiet architect is powerless. She might be the one who built the entire kingdom. If there is anything I learned from this experience, it is that silence is not weakness, expertise is not replaceable, and respect is not optional. The people who underestimate you are often the ones most dependent on your strength. And sometimes life has a way of letting them discover that truth in the most unexpected, unforgettable ways. So before you leave, tell me this. Have you ever been pushed aside, only for life to prove your worth louder than you ever could? Share your story below. I read every comment, and I want to hear your voice. If this story made you think, or made you feel something, tap like, subscribe, and stay with me for more stories that remind us why we rise, even when others try to bury us. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And I cannot wait to hear what you have to say.